Welcome to Back to the Text Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today we'll examine Part 2, Section 7 of the Intro to Being and Time. In this video, I address the following questions. 1. What does Heidegger mean by phenomenology? 2. What is a phenomenon? And 3. How does discourse relate to the phenomenon? If you learned something from this video and want to support this work, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. Section 7 is perhaps one of the most consequential in all of Being and Time, and is one of those passages that presents something new every time you read it. The section establishes the method for how Heidegger plans to proceed in his ontological examination of Dasein and the structures of its existence. This method is phenomenology. So let's move to question 1. What does Heidegger mean by phenomenology? For Heidegger, phenomenology is a method of philosophical research rooted in the how rather than the what. In other words, it's defined less by the subject matter of inquiry, whether it be rocks and trees, states of affairs, or beings, and instead primarily concerns itself with describing how that subject matter is confronted, or rather, how it shows itself. As such, it's consistent with Husserl's famous maxim of returning back to the things themselves. What this doesn't oppose are free-floating constructions and accidental findings. Though Heidegger doesn't use this language here, it suggests a kind of bracketing of abstract theories that often mediate our relationship to the things themselves. Science is a good example because it considers how the self-showing of its objects are secondary to their proposed causal origins. Causality is an abstraction, not only because, as David Hume argued, causes are intrinsically unobservable, but also because causality is always a post hoc or after-the-fact conceptualization of the original phenomenon's self-showing. What do I mean? Well, let's take this can. It shows itself to me as the kind of object that contains a consumable beverage. Part of its functionality is in its shape, that it can be grasped in such a way so as to bring it to my mouth and consume its contents. This is a fairly fundamental relationship with the can. But I can also ask, where did this can come from? How was it made? Who made it? How does it function within a consumerist society, etc.? From these questions, I could then employ any number of ontic sciences that serve as methods of explanation: physics, engineering, economics, social theory, etc. All of these are legitimate modes of inquiry, but they all move beyond my most proximate relationship with the can, which is in terms of its use. Now, what I've done here is not quite phenomenology because the phenomenon is not what is immediately apparent to me. Phenomenological analysis is a labor of the inquirer to work past the seeming immediacy of experience, which itself is always already infused with abstract notions. For instance, the fact that I'm so immersed in the functionality covers over the fact that this can is a particular kind of being that discloses itself to me in its functionality. When it manifests first as a being. Instead, I perhaps reflexively view this can as an object, and myself as an independent subject. However, in phenomenology, the can discloses itself to me from within a world that surrounds me, that allows the can to become meaningful to me. All this is part of the original experience of the can, but it's not necessarily immediately evident to me. In fact, one of the most fundamental forms of abstraction, that being the subject-object divide, is prevalent today in our everyday immediate experience. I, as a subject, look upon the world as a set of independent objects that I can grasp and possess. This is a metaphysical position that serves as a barrier to describing our more primordial relation to the things themselves. It also perhaps holds various implications in terms of our relationship to our bodies as well as nature. Question 2. What is a phenomenon? The word phenomenology is composed of two concepts: the phenomenon and the logos. Heidegger spends a good part of section 7 unpacking each to better understand what phenomenology is. Philosophers often use familiar words in unfamiliar ways, and this can be deeply frustrating for some and risks misunderstanding the argument. A really good way of overcoming confusion and preventing any misunderstandings is to always ask yourself, of any significant term used by a philosopher, what is its etymology? We'll often discover that the philosopher is deploying the concept in a way linked to its etymology. And in doing so, the philosopher takes a word that is perhaps overly familiar to us and adds a new dimension, shaking us free from perhaps some rigid ways of thinking. If you keep that in mind when reading philosophy, especially continental philosophy, you'll make much more progress in understanding the text. So let's turn to the etymology of the word phenomenon, which is the word phenomenon in the Greek. Pha, which is related to the word phos, such as we find in the word phosphorescent, means light or to brighten. Phanestai means to cause to appear, to bring into the light, to disclose, reveal, or show forth. Phenomenon is the noun form of this and means something that comes into view, that shows itself, that manifests. What's the significance of this? It directs us to the method of phenomenology as a science that considers the mode or activity of a thing self-showing. It does not principally concern itself with the what that shows itself per se, but how it shows itself. As already indicated, such showings are not so straightforward. Phenomena are not mere appearances, though every appearance depends upon a phenomenon. The phenomenon is the self-showing in itself. It's the distinctive manner in which something can be encountered. This phenomenological concept of the phenomenon is not the same as the formal concept of the phenomenon as defined by Kant, who limited self-showing to what is accessible through empirical intuition. Such would be a phenomenon reduced to its appearance. This is an object that reflects the order and conceptual structure imposed upon it through the mind's powers of sensibility and understanding. Rather, for phenomenology, an appearance is an announcement of itself through something that shows itself. It's how the phenomenon makes itself known. Yet, there are other ways in which a phenomenon makes itself known other than appearing in empirical intuition. The phenomenon of illness, for example, shows itself through an absence of appearance, as a deficiency of the body. This doesn't mean that illness as a phenomenon is derivative or deficient, but shows how the self-showing of the phenomenon cannot be reduced to mere appearance. Absence and lack also constitute a kind of appearance. Similarly, symbols, such as you find in language, depend upon absences. The manifestation of the symbol is in part through the absence of the thing being symbolized. If it was present, there would be no need to symbolize it through language. And so, speaking of language, question 3, how does discourse relate to the phenomenon? With the etymological understanding of the phenomenon now clarified, we can move on to the ology, the logos of the phenomenon. The logos is commonly understood as the principle of reason and judgment. It also has the meaning of word, speech, and discourse. Heraclitus is attributed with being the first to introduce the term into philosophy, using it as a principle of order and knowledge. The sophists understood logos as discourse, and Aristotle elaborated upon this understanding, indicating that logos is a reasoned discourse or argument, and it's one of the 3 modes of rhetorical persuasion, the other 2 being ethos, which concerns the moral character or expertise of the speaker, and pathos, which tries to persuade through eliciting emotions in the listener. Logos is the attempt to persuade others through the power of argument and reason. However, when dealing with the phenomenon as self-showing, logos comes to mean a specific mode of letting something be seen. It's a discourse that makes manifest what is being talked about in that discourse, making it accessible to others. One of the common criticisms of phenomenology is how it can claim to go back to the things themselves by describing them, when description necessarily entails language. and language always mediates the relation between oneself and the things. Phenomenology, in its etymological sense, makes no pretense to do without language. However, what it suggests is that some forms of discourse make the things themselves less accessible, while other forms make them more accessible. The key is not to forego language, but to find the right kind of language that doesn't impede the phenomenon's self-showing. As we proceed, Heidegger will show us how this still involves some form of interpretation, though perhaps not in the manner it would typically be thought of. In fact, the way logos lets something be seen in its self-showing is through its function of synthesis. Synthesis means to let something be seen as something. In this as structure, when I see the can, I see it as something that delivers a consumable beverage. It's an interpretive act that allows me to perceive something as meaningful. This as structure is integral to Dasein's existence. To conclude, phenomenology is a return back to the things themselves, by letting what shows itself be seen from itself, just as it shows itself, and not in passing it off as something else. This is a descriptive enterprise, though as we'll see in the next video, it is a description of the interpretive activity of Dasein. Important to keep in mind is that nothing stands behind the phenomenon. There is no noumena, no eternal forms, no transcendental categories of the mind. Nonetheless, what shows itself can still be concealed. What exactly is this mode of concealment, and what is being concealed? Addressing this question will lead us back to ontology, whereby Heidegger will make a notable departure from Husserl in claiming that phenomenology is ontology and ontology is phenomenology. So we'll continue with section 7 in the next video, examining the relationship between phenomenology and ontology, as well as phenomenology and hermeneutics. Thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.